My wife headed off on a getaway with her friends, leaving just me and our son, a young man who hadn't walked in a decade. Her car had barely cleared the end of the driveway when I heard something that had no business being real. My son was standing at the top of the stairs. My coffee hit the floor. I lunged for my phone, but his hand locked around my wrist, a grip that should have been impossible. "Dad, we need to get out of this house right now." My name is Gerald Wentworth. I am 70 years old, a retired structural engineer, a man who has spent his entire life dealing in facts, physics, and load-bearing walls. I believe in things I can measure. I do not believe in miracles. But on a quiet Saturday morning, everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and my reality was torn to pieces. It was exactly 5 minutes past 8:00. My wife, Nadine, had just departed for a weekend wine tasting trip in Fredericksburg, Texas. She'd pressed a kiss to my cheek, told me Colton would be fine, and rolled away in her gleaming silver SUV. I was left standing in our big kitchen, out in the Houston suburbs, the refrigerator humming its dull, familiar note. That hum had been the soundtrack to a decade of clockwork routine. 10 years back, a devastating car crash had taken Colton's legs from him, paralyzed from the waist down at 18, just as he'd been getting ready to leave for college. From that moment on, his whole world had shrunk to the ground floor of our house. Nadine had stepped in as his full-time caretaker. She wore the role like a crown, the self-sacrificing mother devoted beyond measure. My role was simpler and harder at once: earn the money, cover the medical bills, the specialists, the endless rounds of private treatment. That Saturday, I was filling my second cup of black coffee, quietly grateful for the rare stillness, a house that more often than not felt like a care facility. Then I heard it. Thud. Slow, unsteady steps from somewhere above me. The engineer in me scrambled for a rational answer. Thermal expansion in the floorboards, a shudder caught by the wind, but the cadence was too purposeful, too alive. Whatever was up there was making its way toward the head of the main oak staircase. My hand started to shake. Welcome back to Dadrevenge. I'm glad you're here with me today. Before we get into the story, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. From what you know so far, whose side do you find yourself on, and why? Just drop a quick word. It means a lot to know who's listening. Now, a brief note: some details in this story have been shaped for audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is entirely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. I stepped out of the kitchen and peered up into the shadowed hallway of the second floor. A figure moved into the pale morning light falling through the high windows. It was Colton. He was on his feet. My 28-year-old son, a young man who hadn't taken a single step in a full decade, was gripping the wooden banister with both hands. He was soaked in sweat, chest heaving with each labored breath. His legs shook violently, trembling under the sheer effort of holding his own weight. His knuckles had gone white against the railing, but he was upright, and he was taking a step down, then another. The ceramic mug slipped from my fingers, cracking apart on the hardwood in a spray of hot coffee that soaked my shoes, and the expensive cream-colored rug Nadine loved so much. I didn't feel the heat. I couldn't feel anything below my knees. I forgot how to breathe. Every medical diagnosis we had, wept over every physical law I understood as an engineer, every certainty I had built my life around, all of it dissolved in the span of 3 seconds. Colton. I whispered, my voice collapsing into a sob. Colton. I rushed toward the base of the stairs, tears instantly burning my eyes. My son. My boy was walking. It was a miracle. It was the absolutely impossible unfolding directly in front of me. I got to the bottom step with both arms extended, terrified he would topple forward and crack his skull on the floor. "I've got you, son," I cried, seizing his waist to hold him steady. "Oh my God, Colton. How is this possible? I need to call an ambulance. I need to call your mother. She is not going to believe this." I dug frantically for my cell phone, my hands shaking so badly the screen wouldn't unlock. I had to reach Nadine, I had to tell her to turn around and get back home immediately. Before my thumb could find the dial, a hand seized my wrist. It was Colton. His grip wasn't feeble. It was frantic. It was like a steel clamp grinding into the bone. I looked up into my son's face expecting joy, or at least exhausted relief. What I found instead was raw, undisguised terror. "Dad! Stop!" He rasped his voice barely above a hoarse whisper. "Do not call anyone." "Colton, you are standing." I sobbed, completely undone. "You are walking. The doctor said you would never walk again. Dad, listen to me." He cut in, his voice dropping to a frantic, urgent pitch that turned my blood to ice. "You need to hear me right now. She did not go to Fredericksburg." I went still. The phone nearly slid out of my damp hand. "What are you talking about? Mom did not go to Fredericksburg, Texas," Colton said, sagging heavily against me, his whole body shuddering with the effort of staying upright. "It is not a girl's trip. She is in the city. Dad, we have to leave this house right now. We have to go before she figures out what I have done." I stared at him, my 70-year-old mind struggling to absorb the cascade of impossible facts. My son was walking. My son was frightened of his own mother. None of it held together. "Colton, you are not making sense," I pleaded, trying to steer him toward the living room sofa. "Let us sit down. You are in shock. The exertion is affecting your thinking." "I am not in shock," he hissed, planting his feet and refusing to move. His eyes kept flicking toward the front door, wild and watchful, like a cornered animal listening for danger. "She is setting you up, Dad. I heard her on the phone last night when she thought I was asleep. She is meeting with her lawyers today. She is having your bank accounts frozen right now. And come Monday morning, she is going to court to have you declared mentally incompetent. She plans to have you committed to a locked psychiatric facility, and then she takes everything." The silence in the house turned absolute. The ticking of the mantel clock on the fireplace shelf rang out like a hammer striking metal. A psychiatric ward. I repeated the phrase silently, the words tasting foreign and foul. "Nadine, your mother. What reason could she possibly have? Why are you walking? What is happening to this family?" "Dad, there is no time for this," Colton urged, pulling at my shirt with a desperate, surprising strength. "You have to trust me. She will lock you away and never let you out, and if that happens, I will never escape this house alive. Please get the keys to the truck." I wanted to tell him he was confused, that his mind was muddled from the physical shock of using his legs again. I wanted to insist that Nadine, the woman I had loved, the woman who had supposedly poured her entire life into caring for him, was incapable of anything so monstrous. I wanted evidence, equations, proof I could hold in my hands. Then my phone buzzed sharply against my palm. I lowered my eyes slowly to the screen, my heart slamming against my ribs. It was an automated alert from my primary bank, the account that held the bulk of my savings money I had kept liquid to cover Colton's intensive physical therapy after selling my engineering firm. I read the message once. Then I read it again. "Urgent security alert. Your primary checking account access has been revoked due to suspicious activity. Please contact your branch administrator immediately." A cold, leaden weight settled in my gut. The kind that tells you the solid ground beneath your feet was never solid at all. The kind that confirms your worst nightmare has stopped being a nightmare and started being Tuesday. I looked at the shattered mug on the floor, the dark coffee bleeding slowly into the wood, destroying the pristine surface Nadine had always been so obsessive about maintaining. It felt like a portrait of my entire existence. I looked back up at Colton, my paralyzed son standing on his own legs, begging me to rescue us from my wife. My wife. The woman who should have been tasting wine in the Texas hill country, who was instead methodically taking my life apart from somewhere in downtown Houston. I slid the phone back into my pocket, My hands had gone completely still. The confusion and denial burned away, replaced by the cold, focused clarity of an engineer who has spotted the critical failure and identified the only way out. "Grab my shoulder, son," I said, my voice flat and steady, every trace of feeling gone. "We are going to the garage. We are leaving right now." I wrapped my right arm firmly around Colton's trembling waist. He felt heavier than I expected, his legs juddering badly under the brutal strain of bearing his own weight for the first time in years. We moved quickly and awkwardly through the long hallway of our home. The house felt alien to me now. It was no longer a refuge. It was an elaborate trap constructed carefully around the lie of my son's shattered spine. Every piece of expensive imported furniture was a brick in the wall of that deception. We reached the heavy oak door at last. Colton was gasping by the time we got there, his face ashen and sheened with cold sweat. I punched the security code into the keypad with a shaking finger. The steel deadbolt snapped open with a crisp, echoing click. We crossed together into the cool, dim garage. The custom handicap-accessible van sat squarely in the center of the concrete floor. I had paid exactly $95,000 for that specific vehicle, equipping it with a motorized ramp system, hydraulic lifts, and full hand controls. It was a monument of steel to the vicious lie Nadine had built around our lives for 10 years. I hauled the passenger door open and half lifted my worn-out son inside. Colton sank heavily into the leather seat chest, still heaving. I jogged around to the driver's side, dropped in behind the wheel, and jabbed the start button. The engine strained and whined a strangled grinding protest, but it would not catch. I pushed the button a second time. Nothing happened. A hollow, dry sputter echoed through the quiet garage. My engineer's mind logged the sound immediately. Not a dead battery. Complete ignition failure. I climbed back out, went to the front, and lifted the hood. I snatched a tactical flashlight from the workbench and aimed the beam at the engine block. My breath stopped in my chest. The spark plugs had been removed. The wires hung loose and useless against the cold metal, dangling like cut strings. This was not a mechanical failure or an unhappy coincidence. It was deliberate, calculated, and deeply malicious sabotage. Nadine had intentionally crippled the van before she breezed out the front door. She knew full well that Colton couldn't safely operate my regular vehicle, and she wanted to guarantee I had no way to take him anywhere if I panicked and bolted. She had engineered our imprisonment inside our own home. A cold, violent wave of fury swept through me. I brought the hood down hard. The bang rang off the garage walls. I swung my gaze to the far corner where my old Chevy pickup truck sat beneath a thick canvas tarp untouched for years. Nadine had always despised the thing. I hadn't put a single mile on it since the day of Colton's accident. I sprinted over and tore the tarp away, sending a billowing cloud of dust into the stale air. The doors were locked tight. The keys were somewhere inside the house, secured in a metal lockbox, whose combination I couldn't recall. I had no time to tear the place apart looking for them. I grabbed a heavy steel wrench from the tool wall, wrapped my jacket around my fist, and punched through the driver's side window. Glass exploded across the concrete in a glittering spray. I reached in, popped the lock, swept the shards off the worn seat, and waved urgently for Colton. He dragged himself across the garage floor with grim, agonizing determination, fighting for every inch, and hauled himself up into the cab. I dropped into the cold driver's seat. No key meant hot wiring. My hands moved on pure muscle memory, decades of mechanical engineering embedded in the tendons. I ripped the plastic panel off the lower steering column. I went straight to the wiring. I found the ignition harness beneath the broken housing, yanked out the red battery wire, and the yellow starter wire, stripped the insulation ends with my teeth, and twisted the bare copper together. The dashboard gauges blinked on. I touched the ignition wire against the bundle. A sharp spray of sparks lit up the cab. The old engine coughed, stumbled twice, then caught with a deep, rattling roar. I shoved it into reverse and slapped the garage door opener clipped to the sun visor. The door began rising with agonizing slowness, far too slow. I put my boot down hard on the accelerator. and the truck launched backward. The roof scraped the bottom edge of the still-rising door with a metal shriek, and we hit the driveway with a squeal of rubber. I slammed the shifter into drive and cranked the wheel. As the headlights swept the quiet residential street, they caught something. A large black SUV moving slowly and silently around our cul-de-sac. No plates. Windows blacked out completely. That was nobody's neighbor heading to an early errand. That was a hired watcher. Nadine had put a professional tail on the house. I cut the headlights and floored it in the opposite direction, swallowed immediately by darkness. We tore through the manicured streets of our suburb, me navigating from memory alone, not daring to slow down. We drove without a word for 2 hours, the old truck rattling toward the rougher edges of Houston. I eventually spotted a crumbling roadside motor lodge and pulled in. I paid cash. I got Colton inside, threw the deadbolt, and finally stopped moving. "Colton," I said into the thick silence, "how long have you been able to walk?" Colton lowered himself onto the edge of the sagging mattress. The light bleeding in from the parking lot carved pale, uneven shadows across his face. He looked down at his hands for a long moment, drew a slow, shuddering breath, then met my eyes. "5 years, Dad." The words were barely audible over the wheeze of the broken air conditioner. 5 years. The number landed in my chest like a dropped beam. 5 years. Half a decade. My mind reeled backward to the start of the whole 10-year ordeal. I shut my eyes for just a moment, pulling up the memory of that sweltering August night, the evening before Colton was supposed to leave for his freshman year at Rice University. The house had been full of packed boxes and barely contained pride. Then the phone rang. The screech of tires. A shattered windshield. The crash that supposedly severed his spinal cord beyond all repair. I remembered the hospital corridors. The antiseptic smell, the fluorescent cold of the ceiling lights, the suffocating weight of not knowing. Then Nadine had stepped out of the consultation room with the lead surgeon. Her face was a composed, heartbroken mask. She walked into my arms and wept softly, and she whispered the words that unmade me. "The damage is permanent, Gerald. His spine is irreparably damaged. He will never walk again." From that moment, our whole existence reorganized itself. Nadine stepped fully into the role of devoted caretaker. She seized control of every detail of his medical management. She declared that any standard rehabilitation program was beneath what our son deserved. She researched relentlessly until she found a private specialist, exclusive, expensive, and highly credentialed, named Dr. Emil Dracott. He offered cutting-edge, bespoke treatment plans that ordinary medicine supposedly couldn't match. I believed her. I trusted her completely because she was my wife, and she performed the role of the tireless, self-sacrificing mother without a single crack in the facade. She dropped her social life. She stayed home every day. She hovered at his wheelchair with hawk-like vigilance, and I played the part assigned to me. I provided. I ground myself down to nothing. When Dr. Dracott's monthly invoices began hollowing out our savings, I didn't flinch. I sold my controlling stake in the engineering firm I had spent 30 years building from nothing. I cashed in my retirement funds. I sold off our secondary properties. I surrendered every piece of the professional life I had constructed, telling myself it was all going toward the finest care in the country for my son. Colton shifted on the worn bedspread, pulling me back into the dim motel room. His breathing was still ragged, his muscles still twitching from the ordeal of our escape. 5 years ago, I started feeling something in my left foot. He went on, his voice unsteady with long suppressed rage and grief. At first it was barely anything. Just a faint tingle, pins and needles. I was so excited, Dad. I actually thought it was a miracle. I told Mom straight away. I told Dr. Dracott the very next morning when he came for my evaluation. I stared at him, my mind grinding hard against the jagged edges of what I was hearing. "If you regained feeling 5 years ago, why did you stay in that chair? Why didn't you tell me?" Colton let out a short, hollow laugh, the kind with no warmth in it anywhere. "I did try to tell you. Do you remember when I kept saying my legs were burning and you thought it was phantom nerve pain? Mom shut down every conversation. But it wasn't just that it was the medication. Every time I showed any real improvement, every time I could flex a toe or tighten a calf muscle, Dr. Draycott would call an emergency consultation. He'd close the bedroom door and whisper with Mom in the hallway. Then they'd come back in together with a revised treatment plan. My stomach turned over. A revised treatment plan. Yes. Colton said, his eyes filling with exhausted, furious tears. Mom called them my special vitamins. She told me Dr. Draycott had mixed a custom compound to prevent painful muscle necrosis. She said I needed them to survive. Every night she'd bring a small paper cup with 2 heavy capsules. She'd stand right there and watch me swallow them. And within 20 minutes, the nightmare would start all over again. He scrubbed both hands across his face, as if trying to physically scour away the memories. The medicine wasn't helping me, Dad. It was doing the opposite. Every time I took those capsules, a thick, suffocating fog rolled in and buried my mind. I couldn't hold a thought. I couldn't put 2 coherent sentences together. It was like being pinned to the bottom of deep water, cut off from everything above. But the physical effect was even worse. Whatever strength I'd managed to coax back into my legs would drain away completely. My muscles became useless. I'd come around the next morning fully paralyzed again, locked inside a body that couldn't do anything, dependent on her for every single thing. I sat in horrified silence, listening. The memories began surfacing on their own. I recalled dragging myself home after a brutal 14-hour shift, stepping into Colton's room and finding him glazed and motionless, staring at the ceiling, a thin trail of drool at the corner of his mouth. Nadine would dab his face with a warm cloth, lift her glistening eyes to mine, and murmur about how rapidly his condition was deteriorating. She said it was the inevitable progression of his neurological damage. She told me to work harder, earn more, so Dr. Draycott could find a better path forward. She looked straight into my face and lied every single day. She took my love for my son and turned it into a weapon, the funding mechanism for a monstrous, years-long fraud. They kept adjusting the dosage. Colton continued, his voice gathering force, stoked by a fury he had clearly been suppressing for years. Anytime my head began to clear, anytime I started asking too many questions or demanding a second opinion from a different doctor, the dose would quietly go up. I was a prisoner, Dad. My own mother was my cruel warden, and Dr. Draycott was her loyal executioner. They were methodically destroying my central nervous system to keep me in that chair. The full scope of the betrayal sat on my chest, like a structural collapse. She had stripped away my life savings to finance a corrupt doctor who was deliberately poisoning our son. Why? I whispered the word, coming out thin and ancient. Why would she do this to him? Colton didn't answer straight away. Instead, he slowly pushed up his sleeve, baring his pale forearm. Beneath the fabric, hidden from any casual glance, were dozens of dark puncture marks, arranged in ragged rows. They weren't treating me. They were sedating me. Colton dropped back onto the edge of the sagging mattress, the sickly light pulsing in from the parking lot through long, warped shadows across his drawn face. He stared at his still trembling hands, pulled a slow breath deep into his chest, and finally raised his eyes to mine. 5 years, Dad. The words barely made it past the rattle of the broken air conditioner. 5 years. It landed like a fist against my sternum. 5 years. Half a decade unaccounted for. My mind sprinted back to the moment all of this began. I pressed my eyes shut for just a breath, and I was back in that suffocating August night 10 years ago, the evening before Colton was set to leave for his freshman year at Rice University. The house had been crammed with labeled boxes and electric with pride. Then came the phone call. The scream of tires. A windshield reduced to powder. The wreck that supposedly destroyed his spinal cord beyond any recovery. I remembered those hospital corridors. The antiseptic smell embedded in the walls. The fluorescent chill overhead. The sick helplessness of waiting. Then Nadine appeared from the consultation room alongside the attending surgeon. Her face was perfectly heartbreakingly composed. She stepped into my arms and wept against my shoulder, and between soft sobs she delivered the words that shattered me completely. The damage is permanent, Gerald. His spine is irreparably damaged. He will never walk again. Everything changed after that. Nadine stepped forward as the devoted, tireless caretaker. She absorbed every detail of his medical care with a total, consuming focus. Any standard rehabilitation program, she insisted, was inadequate for their son. She threw herself into research and eventually produced a private specialist, exclusive, outrageously expensive, and bearing impeccable credentials, Dr. Emil Dracott. He promised individualized, advanced treatments that conventional medicine supposedly couldn't offer. I believed every word. I trusted her without reservation because she was my wife, and she inhabited the role of the self-sacrificing mother with flawless, unbroken commitment. She resigned from every club and social obligation. She was home every day without exception. She never left his side. And I did what I understood my job to be. I provided. I wore myself down to the marrow. When Dr. Dracott's bills started hollowing out our accounts, I never hesitated. I sold my controlling interest in the engineering firm I had built across 30 years of hard work. I liquidated my retirement savings. I sold the secondary properties. I handed over every material thing I had built across a lifetime, convinced I was buying my son the finest medical attention in the country. Colton shifted his weight on the thin bedspread and pulled me back into the present. His breathing was still uneven, his limbs still trembling with the aftershock of everything he'd put himself through to get us out. 5 years ago, a burning sensation started in my left foot. He said, his voice fraying between anger and grief. Then in the beginning, it was barely there, just a low tingle like circulation coming back. I was overjoyed, Dad. I genuinely believed something had shifted. I told Mom right away. I told Dr. Dracott the very next morning when he arrived for my evaluation. I watched my son's face, my analytical mind pushing hard against the edges of what I was hearing. If sensation had returned 5 years ago, why had he stayed in that wheelchair? Why had he never told me directly? Colton produced a short, flat laugh, no warmth in it at all. I did try. Do you remember those weeks when I kept saying my legs felt like they were on fire, and you assumed it was phantom nerve pain? Mom cut off every conversation before it went anywhere. And beyond that, there was the medication. Every single time I demonstrated real progress, every time I could move a toe or engage a muscle, Dr. Dracott would call an emergency session. He'd shut the bedroom door and hold a low conference with Mom in the hallway. Then they'd walk back in together with a new treatment protocol. My gut clenched hard. A new protocol. Yes, Colton said, tears of frustrated rage rising in his eyes. Mom called them my special vitamins. She said Dr. Dracott had developed a proprietary formula specifically to prevent painful muscle necrosis. She told me I'd deteriorate without them. Every night she'd arrive with a small paper cup holding 2 capsules, and she would stand right there watching me until I'd swallowed both of them. Within 20 minutes, it would all start again. He ground his palms into his eyes, trying to push the images back down. The medicine didn't help me, Dad. It worked against me. Each time I swallowed those capsules, a deadening fog took hold of my mind. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't follow a single line of reasoning. I felt submerged, detached from everything, real, adrift somewhere below the surface. And then my body would follow. Every gain I had made in my legs would vanish overnight. My muscles turned to dead weight. I'd surface the next morning completely paralyzed again, every inch of me reliant on her exactly as she intended. The sheer magnitude of what she had done refused to fit inside my head. She had bled my finances dry to pay a hired doctor to keep our son chemically imprisoned. Why? I whispered the word worn hollow. Why would she do this to you? Colton didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly pushed up his sleeve, exposing his pale forearm. Tucked beneath the fabric were dozens of dark puncture marks clustered in ugly rows. They were not treating me. They were sedating me. I stared at the bruised, pocked skin on my son's arm. Those marks were a brutal chart of 10 years of deliberate abuse. My stomach knotted with a nauseating tangle of guilt and fury. For a full decade, I had faithfully paid the staggering medical bills, putting my blind trust in the woman I'd married to care for the son we had raised together. She had convinced me my only role was to write the checks, and I had surrendered my place as his protector without a fight. I reached out with an unsteady hand and drew Colton's sleeve back down over the evidence, covering it gently. The weight of the revelation threatened to shut my mind down entirely, but I would not allow that. I am a structural engineer. My entire career was built on understanding how immense forces act on a foundation, identifying the hairline fractures before the whole structure gives way. My family was giving way right now, and its entire foundation had been poured from deliberate, calculated lies. I wiped my face with both palms and drew a long, slow breath, forcing my pulse back down. I had to stop being a grieving father and become a cold, forensic analyst. I pushed up off the sagging bed and crossed to the scratched veneer desk in the dim corner of the room. I unzipped my leather satchel and pulled out my laptop. The screen lit up the stale walls of our hiding place with a pale blue glow. Colton watched me from the edge of the mattress without a word, his breathing finally beginning to after the physical ordeal of our escape. Nadine believed she had me cornered by cutting off access to our primary checking and savings accounts. She assumed that choking my cash flow would leave me frightened, disoriented, and willing to comply with whatever she demanded. She had badly misjudged the depth of my financial preparations. In the most profitable years of my engineering firm, I had quietly built a set of secondary tax shelter accounts and a private corporate trust she had never been told about. Those accounts sat behind their own separate authentication protocols, routed through an entirely different financial institution from anything we held jointly. My fingers moved across the keyboard with stiff precision, entering the passphrases and access keys I had committed to memory years ago. Inside 3 minutes, I had stepped around her blockade entirely. I had full access to the complete ledger of our shared credit lines and the transaction history going back years. I pulled up the live activity on the premium platinum card Nadine kept tucked in her designer bag at all times. She had told me she was heading up the coast to Fredericksburg, Texas for a long weekend of wine tasting with close friends. I expected to see gas charges somewhere on the road out of town or a hotel deposit in the hill country. The transaction record told an entirely different story. Her card had not been used anywhere near a Texas vineyard. Exactly 30 minutes after she had kissed my cheek and pulled cheerfully out of our driveway, a large pending charge had been authorized at a 5-star hotel in the heart of downtown Houston. She hadn't left the city at all. I scrolled on my jaw, tightening with every line. After the hotel deposit came a rapid sequence of large purchases at high-end retail boutiques along the Galleria. She had put $12,000 through a luxury jeweler and another $8,000 at an exclusive designer clothing store, all within a window of just 4 hours. This was no girl's weekend. She was celebrating. She was burning through money I had earned while she finalized the legal groundwork to have me permanently sealed inside a psychiatric ward. I sat back and let the full weight of her scheme settle over me. The truth worked. Like a floodlight switched on in a dark room, throwing harsh light into every corner of the past 10 years. I started re-examining the entire decade with a clarity that was almost unbearable. I thought about the frantic early weeks after Colton's accident. I had gone out and hired the finest private rehabilitation nurses available, a full, dedicated team I wanted living in our home, to ensure his comfort and give him every possible chance at recovery. But Nadine had systematically fired each one of them. She declared the first was negligent in her duties. She accused the second of helping herself to jewelry from her personal collection. She claimed the third made Colton feel unsafe in his own room. Within a year, she had severed every connection he had to the outside medical world, positioning herself as the sole person managing his daily care. She had isolated me just as thoroughly. Every time I tried to review his medical charts or asked to sit in on one of his sessions with Dr. Emile Draycott, she would lay her hand softly against my chest and give me a slow, sorrowing shake of her head. "Oh, you are getting older, Gerald," she would say, in that finely tuned, patronizing tone she had spent years perfecting. "Your blood pressure is already suffering under the strain of running the firm. You keep us financially stable and I will handle the medical side. Leave that weight to me." It was masterful. It was a calculated exercise in psychological manipulation. She had turned my age, my career, and the depth of my love for my family into a blindfold, and I had worn it willingly. I leaned back toward the laptop screen and narrowed my focus, pulling up the full archival transaction records for the past 36 months. I was hunting for the financial fingerprint of her arrangement with Dr. Draycott. I moved quickly past the household expenses, the utility payments, the weekly grocery charges. Then I found it. It was buried deep in the automated transfer history, disguised as a recurring corporate real estate investment. On the 15th of every month for the past 5 consecutive years, exactly $25,000 had been routed from our joint investment portfolio into a private limited liability holding company. I highlighted the entry and read the registered corporate name aloud into the empty motel room. Draycott and V Real Estate. Draycott and V Real Estate. The name tolled in my head like a struck bell. I eased the laptop shut, careful not to disturb Colton. He had finally surrendered to sleep on the other bed, his chest rising and falling with a steady ease I hadn't seen from him in years. I pulled a spare blanket over his legs, checked that the deadbolt was locked tight, and walked out into the cold night air. I needed a public network I could use without a trace. I drove the old Chevy out along the dark highway until the lit sign of a 24-hour diner appeared through the windshield. A bell chimed overhead as I pushed through the door. I took a corner booth in the back and ordered a black coffee I never intended to touch. I opened the laptop connected to the diner's open network and angled the screen away from the tired waitress working the counter. My engineering training had taught me to trace structural failures down to the smallest hairline crack. Financial fraud was the same discipline entirely. You follow the fractures until you locate the broken beam. I started with the man who had spent years prescribing my son a slow poison. I ran Dr. Emile Draycott's name through the State Medical Board database. What came back first was a polished, carefully curated profile, glowing testimonials, prestigious institutional ties, an impressive list of credentials. But I knew how to push past the surface. I ran his details through a federal registry, cross-referencing old license numbers and prior addresses. That is where the clean exterior began to come apart. 8 years before Nadine brought him into our home, Draycott had his medical license quietly suspended in the state of Florida. The disciplinary records were buried under dense legal language, but the underlying offense was plain enough. He had been under investigation for egregious medical malpractice, specifically the reckless overprescription of powerful sedatives and highly experimental chemical compounds to some of the most vulnerable patients imaginable. He'd sidestepped federal prison only by voluntarily surrendering his state medical license and slipping quietly out of sight. Nadine hadn't stumbled upon some miracle healer. She had gone looking deliberately and methodically for a disgraced, desperate man with a well-documented record of serious medical abuse. I pulled up public property tax records for the greater Houston area, tracking down the holding company I'd just spotted on my wife's shared credit card statement, Draycott and V Real Estate. The results loaded in an instant, and my jaw locked so tight my back molars throbbed. This wholly disgraced, entirely unlicensed practitioner currently held 3 ultra-luxury residential penthouses right in the wealthy heart of the city. Their combined market value cleared $6 million with ease. No private rehabilitation doctor working with a single paralyzed patient could ever legitimately accumulate a real estate portfolio of that scale. He wasn't drawing a regular salary. He was being cut in continuously generously on a far larger and meticulously coordinated criminal operation. But where was the original capital actually coming from? My personal engineering wealth was considerable, yet I had kept a firm grip on my liquid assets. Somehow millions of dollars were flowing in from somewhere else entirely. The answer struck me with the crushing, breathless force of a freight train. My late brother, Leonard. Before Leonard was taken by aggressive pancreatic cancer 7 years ago, he had legally established a large, irrevocable medical trust fund devoted entirely to his beloved nephew. That private trust had been seeded with exactly $8 million explicitly designated by law to cover Colton's lifelong medical care, specialized mobility equipment, and any future reconstructive surgeries. Because my schedule at the engineering firm was relentlessly consuming, and because I had placed absolute faith in the woman I'd married, I had willingly signed over primary administrative control of that trust to Nadine. She was the legally named custodial caregiver. She held total, wholly unchecked authority over how those funds were disbursed, provided the expenses were categorized as necessary medical treatments. I logged securely into the private wealth management portal using an administrative bypass code I had quietly set up back when Leonard first drafted those dense legal documents. I went straight to the main trust ledger. My trembling hands floated over the glowing keys. I drew a sharp breath and hit enter. 10 full years of detailed financial history filled the screen. I stared at the numbers as a wave of deep, sickening nausea moved through me like a tide. It was an absolute financial slaughter. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been methodically bled out month after month, year after grinding year. Every outgoing wire transfer had been personally authorized by Nadine and routed to various obscure shell companies held entirely by Dr. Emile Draycott. The expense categories were inventively diverse and completely fabricated. Advanced experimental neurological stimulation therapy, highly specialized spinal cord cellular regeneration protocols, advanced custom mobility equipment procurement. It was a breathtakingly sophisticated, immaculately documented paper trail of pure, uncut lies. Every dollar set aside to give my son a fuller, more comfortable life had been funneled directly to a corrupt and evil man payment to keep that boy chemically imprisoned in a rusted wheelchair. They were literally billing the trust fund to continuously poison its sole beneficiary. I scrolled frantically to the bottom of the ledger to find the current balance. The glowing red figures confirmed my most dreaded fear. The $8 million safety net Leonard had built out of love for his nephew was gone. Barely $30,000 remained. Nadine and Draycott had stripped the family's financial foundation bare, but the final, most chilling piece of the puzzle was still unaccounted for. If the trust was completely drained, why was Nadine taking such a catastrophic legal risk right now? Why was she engineering an elaborate scheme to have me declared mentally incompetent and committed to a psychiatric facility? This coming Monday, I checked the date on the screen, then looked at the total value of my own remaining personal assets. My private investment portfolios, my commercial real estate holdings, and the equity in our marital home added up to roughly $4 million. As long as I was legally classified as competent, she couldn't touch a cent of that wealth. My estate was shielded by strict legal protections requiring my direct physical signature before any significant asset could be liquidated. The true terrifying scope of her timeline suddenly snapped into focus. She had completely exhausted Colton's trust fund. The golden goose was dead. Her extravagant lifestyle, the upscale hotel stays, the designer shopping sprees, and Draycott's sprawling luxury real estate empire had all run dry. She needed a fresh source of substantial money, and she needed it now. I was the next target. I was the next target. The sheer icy magnitude of her sociopathic greed settled into my bones. Every instinct in me screamed to grab my phone and call the authorities, to shout the truth at anyone who would hear it. But my analytical mind clamped down hard on that dangerous emotional reflex. If I walked into a police precinct at 70 years old, raving about a decade-long conspiracy involving a prominent medical specialist, a deliberately faked paralysis, and a hidden luxury real estate empire, I would sound precisely like a man unraveling at the seams. I'd be stepping directly into the trap she had so carefully constructed. She already had a forged medical evaluation declaring me legally unsound. She was building an airtight conservatorship case to seize what remained of my estate. A frantic, unsubstantiated police report would simply be the last nail in my coffin. What I needed was hard, irrefutable physical proof. I needed the actual substance she was using to keep my son compliant and helpless. I glanced across the dimly lit room. Colton was sleeping soundly, his chest rising and falling in the quiet, dusty shadows of the cheap motel room. I wrote out a careful, detailed set of instructions on a sheet of thin motel stationery and left it beside a prepaid burner phone I'd picked up earlier at a desolate gas station. I secured the heavy deadbolt from the outside and stepped out into the bitter Houston night. I drove my old rattling Chevy pickup back toward our affluent suburb, my mind locked entirely on what lay ahead. The winding residential streets were deserted at exactly 2:00 in the morning, washed in the pale yellow glow of tall streetlights. I left the truck 3 blocks from my own property. I had no intention of tripping the motion-activated security cameras mounted above our wide paved driveway. I moved silently across the damp, cold grass of neighboring yards, closing in on my own home like a trespasser in the dead of night. The custom-built brick structure loomed dark and vaguely sinister in the shadows. I bypassed the main exterior alarm by accessing the secondary utility box concealed behind the dense rhododendron growth near the side gate. I had personally designed and installed the entire security grid exactly 5 years ago, so I knew precisely how to blind the exterior laser sensors without tripping a silent panic signal to the monitoring company. I eased through the heavy glass patio door and stepped into the vast, silent kitchen. The house felt cold, hostile, and hollow. I moved through the dark and familiar hallways from pure muscle memory, knowing exactly which imported oak floorboards would betray me with a creak and which would hold silent. I advanced with agonizing patience, my heart hammering against my ribs until I reached the solid mahogany door of Nadine's private home office. She kept it locked at all times. From my jacket pocket, I produced a thin steel tension wrench and a small picking hook tools I regularly used for calibrating delicate engineering instruments. In under 40 seconds, the brass lock gave a sharp click. I slipped inside, eased the door shut behind me, and switched on my compact tactical flashlight. The focused beams swept across her spotless, meticulously arranged glass desk. Deep in my gut, I knew she was deliberately concealing the actual medication somewhere inside this room. I worked through every wooden drawer, every locked filing cabinet, every decorative box on the wide shelves, slowly, quietly, methodically. Nothing. I stood motionless at the center of the darkened room and forced myself to think like the structural engineer I had always been. I studied the primary load-bearing walls, hunting for any spatial irregularity or architectural anomaly. My eyes settled on a large, heavy oil painting hanging dead center on the far wall. I lifted the ornate frame free of its brass hooks and eased it down onto the carpet. A flush-mounted steel wall safe stared back at me from the exposed plaster. It was an older mechanical combination model, reliable serious hardware. I had no access code, but a lifetime in engineering had given me an acutely sensitive ear for internal acoustics and metal friction. I drew a standard high-quality medical stethoscope from my worn leather satchel, a simple diagnostic tool I had bought from an all-night drugstore on the long drive over. I pressed the cold acoustic chest piece against the heavy steel door, positioning it just beside the rotating brass dial. I seated the rubber earpieces firmly in my ears, shut my eyes, and began turning the dial with agonizing slowness. I listened for the faint, distinct click of each internal tumbler dropping into its machined slot. It demanded a patience bordering on the physical. Click. That was the first tumbler. I immediately reversed the rotation, tracking the delicate scrape of brass against cold steel. Click.
The second tumbler settled into place. I rotated the dial one final deliberate turn to the right. A heavy resonant clunk traveled clearly through the stethoscope. I seized the steel handle and pulled it down hard. The safe door swung open with a soft, almost satisfied mechanical exhale. I directed the flashlight beam into the interior. 4 unmarked, transparent plastic medication bottles sat inside. Every original pharmaceutical label had been stripped clean. Then the unmistakable sound of the front door being unlocked rang through the silent house. My heart slammed hard against my ribs.
The front door thudded shut, and heavy footsteps were already crossing the hardwood floors of the main foyer. These were not the measured clicks of Nadine's heels. They were heavy, urgent, and male. I had seconds. I lunged forward and snatched all 4 unmarked bottles from the open safe. I shoved them into the deep inner pockets of my jacket. I swept my hand across the glass desk and grabbed the thick manila folder holding the forged psychiatric evaluations I'd found moments earlier. I needed cover fast. The office offered almost nothing for a man my size. My eyes found the tall, louved mahogany doors of a walk-in storage closet tucked into the far corner of the room. I threw myself across the Persian carpet and wedged into the narrow darkness of the closet, just as the brass handle of the office door began to turn. I eased the louved door shut behind me, leaving a hair's width of gap to see through. I pressed my back flat against the cold plaster and stopped breathing. The office door swung open with a hard, aggressive push. The overhead lights blazed on and knifed through the wooden slats into my eyes. As my vision adjusted, I recognized who had come in. It was not my wife. It was Dr. Emil Draycott. He bore no resemblance to the composed, quietly arrogant professional who typically drifted into our home with his leather medical bag. Tonight, his expensive tailored jacket was wrinkled and stained. His silk tie hung loose at his collar, and a visible sheen of sweat coated his forehead. He was breathing hard, his eyes sweeping the room in rapid, desperate arcs. He moved straight for the glass desk, walking right past the open wall safe in his blind panic. He began tearing through the stacked paperwork, flinging stationery and leather-bound financial ledgers onto the floor in frantic handfuls. I watched him from the darkness, tracking every erratic move. He was searching for the exact folder now pressed against my chest. He swore sharply, a vicious sound that cut through the quiet of my home like a blade. He drove his fist into the glass desktop and began pacing a caged animal burning through its own fear. After a long stretch of fruitless searching, he yanked his phone from his pocket, jabbed at the screen, and slapped the speaker button before dropping it on the cluttered desk. The ringing filled the room. Nadine picked up on the second ring. Her voice was clipped, irritated, stripped of any softness. "Emil, what exactly is taking you so long?" she demanded. "Did you get the documents from the desk?" Dr. Draycott hunched over the glowing phone, his face a rigid mask of fury and anxiety. "I am looking right now, Nadine. The files are not where you told me they would be. I need those forged psychiatric evaluations in my hands tonight. You told me they were finalized and sitting right there on the desk." Nadine exhaled loudly through the speaker. "They are there, Emil. Stop panicking like a child and look properly. I left them right beside the lamp. We cannot afford any mistakes at this stage." "I am not panicking," Draycott hissed, sweeping a stack of envelopes off the desk. "I am trying to lock down our investment. If I don't have those legal papers in my briefcase by tomorrow morning, the entire timeline slips. We need to file with the court immediately. By Monday noon, the judge grants the medical conservatorship. The moment that gavel comes down, Gerald is legally erased. The police haul him straight to the locked psychiatric ward, and we have full, uncontested access to every last dollar of his $4 million estate." My blood turned to ice water. Hearing their scheme spoken aloud calmly, methodically, inside my own home was a violation that reached somewhere beneath rational thought. They had mapped out my total destruction with the same casual register one might use to run through a grocery list. I tightened my grip on the manila folder in the dark. The physical proof of their crime was here with me in my hands. I shut my eyes briefly and steadied my breathing. The conversation was not over. Nadine's voice shifted. It dropped into something colder, entirely clinical, scrubbed of anything human. Once Gerald is safely put away, we have to deal with the boy immediately, she said. Colton has been moving far too much lately. He told me this morning his legs were burning. He's building a tolerance to the current compound. Draycott groaned, dragging a hand through his thinning hair. I know Nadine. I saw the muscle spasms at my last evaluation. The nerve blocks are starting to fail. Once his meddling father is out of the picture, we increase the dosage. We double the compound in his evening pills. Tucken. It will destroy his motor function entirely within 48 hours. He'll be completely compliant, a vegetable effectively, and we won't have to worry about him trying to stand again. Fine, Nadine said. Get the papers and get out of the house. Meet me back at the hotel suite. Draycott ended the call. He turned his head slowly, dark eyes combing the quiet room. Then his gaze landed on the louvered mahogany closet doors. My heart seized. He took one slow, deliberate step toward them. In the darkness, I reached out without a sound. My fingers closed around a heavy metal paperweight, ready to bring it down hard. Dr. Emile Draycott's sweaty palm closed around the brass handle of the closet door and rattled it. My knuckles turned completely white around the metal weight. Every muscle in my body coiled like a loaded spring, braced for a violent and desperate confrontation. I pressed myself back into the suffocating darkness and held my breath. The instant that door came open, I was going to drive the solid metal into his skull. Then, just as the hinges began to groan, a sharp ringtone detonated the tension. Draycott recoiled, yanking his hand off the door handle. He lurched across the carpet and snatched his glowing phone from the cluttered glass desk. It was Nadine calling back. Her voice came through the speaker as a frantic, shrill cry. "Get out of there right now!" she screamed. "The security company just called about a power fluctuation on the exterior sensors. If Gerald tripped an alarm, the police could already be on their way. Take whatever medical files you can grab and go now." Draycott came apart completely. He rammed the phone into his jacket pocket and abandoned any further search for the forged documents currently pressed against my chest. He scooped a random fistful of irrelevant billing invoices off the floor, shoved them into his leather briefcase, and bolted from the office. I tracked his heavy footsteps hammering down the hallway. Seconds later, the front door crashed shut with a deep, resonant thud, followed by the violent shriek of tires tearing out of the driveway. I exhaled in a long, ragged shudder, my whole body trembling from the adrenaline flooding through me. I gave it 3 agonizing minutes in the dark before I was satisfied the house was truly empty. Then I shouldered the closet doors open and stepped carefully back into the lit office. I tucked the manila folder with the forged psychiatric evaluations and all 4 unmarked pill bottles deep inside my winter jacket and moved through the silent house. I eased out the back patio door and dissolved into the cold shadows of the sleeping neighborhood. At the old Chevy pickup, I dropped into the driver's seat and locked the doors. I didn't head back to the crumbling roadside motor lodge, not yet. I had one urgent destination that couldn't wait. My engineering mind was running at full capacity. I needed hard scientific proof of exactly what chemical poison was being fed to my son night after night. I pushed the truck hard through the empty expressways, driving straight to a discreet 24-hour private testing laboratory on the industrial outskirts of the city. The facility belonged to Norbert Callum, a brilliant retired chemical engineer and one of the few men I trusted without reservation. I had personally helped Norbert secure the structural permits for that very building more than a decade ago. I knew he kept late hours, preferring the absolute stillness of the deep night for his complex analytical work. I swung into the empty parking lot and hammered my fist against the reinforced steel security door. Norbert appeared after a long minute-stained white lab coat, thick glasses pushed up on his forehead, tired eyes widening with pure surprise. "Gerald," he said. What on earth brings you here at this hour? I pushed past him into the bright laboratory. There's no time for small talk, Norbert. I need your expertise, and this stays completely off the books. I reached into my jacket and set all 4 unmarked plastic pill bottles on his stainless steel examination table. Norbert studied the capsules, his professional instincts sharpening immediately. What exactly are these, Gerald? I pulled a thick wad of $100 bills from my worn leather satchel, exactly $6,000 in cold cash funds I had deliberately withdrawn during my initial escape. I slid the stack across the cold metal table. I don't know what they are, Norbert, but I believe they're unregulated neurotoxins. I need a full chemical analysis, every compound in those capsules, and I need the toxicology report in my hands within 24 hours. No questions of the legal variety. Norbert looked at the money, then looked at my eyes. Whatever he saw there settled it. He nodded slowly, drawing the bottles and the cash to his side of the table. I'll run the mass spectrometer right now, Gerald. You'll have your answers by morning. I thanked him and stepped back out into the bitter Houston wind. I checked the dashboard clock. Exactly 5:00 in the morning. The sky had just begun to bruise at the edges, a deep, battered purple bleeding into the black. One final stop remained before I could get back to my son. I put the truck in gear and drove toward the gated communities of River Oaks. I was going to Conrad Whitley's house. Conrad wasn't merely my corporate attorney. He was a ferociously sharp, intensely loyal legal predator who had defended my engineering firm against every manner of corporate assault for more than 20 years. He was the only person I trusted to steer us through the legal catastrophe bearing down on us. I left the truck sitting crookedly in his pristine driveway and went straight up the stone steps. I pounded on the heavy oak front door with my right fist hard sustained without apology. I didn't care who heard it. I kept going until my knuckles pulsed with a dull, persistent ache. After 3 long minutes, the door flew open. Conrad stood there in a silk bathrobe, gray hair wrecked from sleep, face flushed with indignant fury. "Gerald, have you lost your mind?" he hissed, cinching the robe's belt. "Do you know what time it is?" I stepped past him and walked straight into the grand marble foyer. "We don't have time to sleep, Conrad," I said, moving with purpose into his formal dining room. I upended my leather satchel over the polished mahogany table. The forged psychiatric evaluations and the printed financial records documenting the looted trust fund fanned out under the overhead light. Conrad leaned in, and I could see the moment his legal mind locked onto what he was looking at. "What is all this, Gerald?" he whispered, visibly shaken. I met his eyes directly. "Conrad, I have 48 hours before my wife legally dismantles my mind, steals my freedom, and kills my son. We are going to war." Conrad stood motionless on his marble floor, sleep-drained eyes fixed on the documents spread across the table. He reached out and lifted the forged psychiatric evaluation, carrying Dr. Emile Draycott's signature. I watched his expression travel from stunned disbelief to cold, calculating fury. He set it down and picked up the financial ledger, laying out the complete destruction of the $8 million trust fund. When he finally looked up at me, his face had shed all its color. "Gerald, this is a precision-built legal guillotine." His voice was low, trembling with equal parts professional admiration and personal revulsion. "She has assembled a flawless false record, severe dementia, escalating paranoia, all of it perfectly documented. If Nadine walks into that probate courthouse Monday morning and files this petition first, you are finished." He began to pace bare feet, quiet against the cold marble. "The conservatorship statutes are merciless, Gerald. The moment a judge signs an emergency medical order, every fundamental right you possess evaporates instantly. You cannot retain your own counsel. You cannot touch your own accounts. You cannot legally contest your own institutionalization. The police will show up at your door, put you in restraints, and transport you to a locked psychiatric ward. And the worst of it, Nadine immediately assumes full legal control of your $4 million estate and complete medical authority over Colton." He stopped pacing. "The county clerk's office opens in under 48 hours. We cannot sit back and play defense. If she files first, we will be buried in legal quicksand for years, and Colton will not survive that timeline. I stood perfectly still and let the full weight of his assessment settle into me. What comes next stopped me cold the first time I lived through it, because it forced me to ask how far a person will go to protect what they love. Before we get there, tell me honestly, if you suspected someone close to you was quietly working against you, would you confront them the moment you knew? Or would you gather every piece of proof first and say nothing? What's our countermove, Conrad? I asked, my voice holding steady despite the storm of pure panic raging inside my chest. Conrad stopped pacing and drove both hands flat onto the table. We ambush her, he said fiercely, eyes burning with absolute resolve. We dismantle her entire operation before she gets anywhere near the courthouse steps. He moved straight into his adjacent home office, silk bathrobe and all, and powered up his desktop computer. I'm drafting emergency counter-injunctions right now, he called over the machine's rising hum. I'll personally file an urgent petition for a temporary restraining order against Nadine and Dr. Draycott the second a duty judge is reachable, but we need heavy immediate firepower to guarantee they are arrested on the spot. He snatched his phone from the charging dock and dialed a specific unlisted number from memory. I have a long-owed favor with Captain Pruitt at the Financial Crimes Division, he said quickly as the line rang. Relentless investigator, absolutely despises medical fraud. Conrad walked Captain Pruitt through the core of the scheme, the $8 million embezzlement, Draycott's concealed luxury real estate portfolio. By the time he ended the call 30 minutes later, the trap was set. Captain Pruitt was quietly standing up a discreet task force to freeze the hidden accounts and prepare felony arrest warrants for massive financial fraud and attempted medical homicide. We were going to bring the full weight of the law down on them. I left Conrad hammering out legal petitions in his dark office and drove the rattling truck back through the waking city. The morning sun was just cresting the horizon, laying long, pale streaks of light across empty industrial streets. I pulled into the crumbling roadside motor lodge parking lot, my chest tight with an aching, desperate need to see my boy. I turned the deadbolt and pushed the creaking door open. Colton was sitting bolt upright on the edge of the sagging mattress, gripping the cheap bedsheets with white-knuckled terror. His face was drained of color, slick with cold sweat, his breathing fast and shallow. "Dad!" He choked, his voice fracturing with raw fear. "I thought she'd found us. I thought you weren't coming back." I crossed the small room in 3 strides and pulled my grown son into a fierce, tight embrace. He pressed his face against my winter jacket shoulders, shaking with years of trapped trauma and immediate panic. I held him close, both arms around his trembling frame, my chin resting gently on the top of his head. For the first time in 10 long, agonizing years, a single hot tear broke free and traced a line down my weathered cheek. Not from sorrow, from absolute unwavering determination. "I'm right here, Colton," I whispered into the quiet, dusty room, pulling him closer. "I will never leave you alone with them again. You are safe now." I drew back slightly and looked directly into his exhausted, frightened eyes. "You walked today, son," I said, my voice thick with a paternal pride I could barely contain. "You fought through 10 years of chemical torture, and you walked. Tomorrow, you're going to stand tall and watch them burn." Colton looked back at me, and something shifted in his eyes, a small, fragile spark of genuine hope pressing through the heavy, suffocating fear. He gave a slow nod, his breathing finally beginning to level out in the safety of that hidden room. I reached into my pocket to retrieve the prepaid burner phone I had left him, intending to check for any messages from Conrad. Before my hand could close around it, my own phone vibrated hard against my hip. The sudden jolt made us both flinch. I drew it out and looked at the screen. Norbert Callum calling from the private chemical laboratory. I answered at once, my chest contracting with sharp anticipation. "Norbert, what did you find?" I asked, voice dropping to a low, urgent rasp. A long, heavily weighted silence stretched across the line. When Norbert finally spoke, the calm, analytical steadiness I always associated with him was completely gone. "Gerald," he said, his voice unsteady, breathing audible through the receiver. "I ran the compounds through the mass spectrometer 3 separate times to be certain. This is not human medication, Gerald. The primary active ingredient is a tightly regulated synthetic paralytic used exclusively in large-scale veterinary practice. It's a severe neuromuscular blocking agent, formulated specifically for euthanizing massive livestock. Where in the world did you get this?" I stood motionless, the phone pressed hard against my ear. Norbert's horrified voice cut through the quiet of that motel room, shattering the last intact corner of my reality. The capsules held no form of human medicine. They contained a potent synthetic chemical engineered to progressively paralyze large agricultural animals. Norbert explained, his voice shaking with professional revulsion, that prolonged repeated exposure to this particular compound would systematically destroy human muscle tissue, inducing deep paralysis and a devastating neurological fog that would leave its victim trapped inside a failing body. Nadine, the woman I had given my entire life to, had been poisoning our own flesh and blood. She had carefully administered heavy-grade animal tranquilizers to our son every single night for a full decade. I thanked Norbert in a hollow whisper and ended the call. The sheer unqualified evil of what she had done felt like a physical force compressing my chest. I went back to Conrad's formal dining room, where he was methodically working through the stack of forged documents and financial ledgers I'd brought from the safe. He had already called in Bowen, a trusted private investigator and retired federal agent who sat quietly at the long mahogany table running Nadine's financial history through a classified digital database in search of any hidden offshore accounts or property deeds connected to Draycott. We sat in heavy silence as the morning sun climbed the sky. Around noon, Bowen's fingers went still on the keyboard. He pushed his wire-rimmed glasses slowly up the bridge of his nose and released a long, controlled breath. "Gerald," he said quietly, and the weight in his voice sent a fresh wave of cold directly through me. "I found something buried deep inside the archived bank records from the safe. This is not another real estate acquisition or a covert transfer to the doctor." Bowen turned his laptop so that Conrad and I could both see the screen. He pointed to a specific encrypted wire transfer originating from Nadine's personal checking account. The timestamp was precise and unmistakable. An outgoing payment of exactly $50,000 in cash, permanently processed exactly 10 years ago. I leaned in close, my tired eyes moving carefully across the stark black text. The transfer had gone through on a Tuesday in late August, exactly 48 hours before Colton was set to load up his car and drive across the country to begin his freshman year at Rice University. Exactly 2 days before the catastrophic vehicle crash that supposedly severed his spinal cord and ended his future. "Who received the money?" I asked. My voice had dropped to something low and dangerous. Bowen pulled up the routing numbers and the corresponding business license. The recipient was a small, shady, independent auto mechanic operating a failing garage on the industrial fringe of the city. He shuttered the shop and left the state entirely less than 1 week after Colton's accident. The monstrous truth locked into place with the cold, irrefutable precision of an engineering calculation. The crash was not a tragedy. It was not random. It was a commission. Nadine had deliberately paid a desperate mechanic to cut the brake lines on our son's car. She had tried to maim or kill her own child, because if Colton had made it to college, she would have lost her legally designated role as his custodial caregiver. She would have lost her unchecked access to the $8 million medical trust fund my late brother Leonard had built for him. Her motive was psychopathic in its simplicity and its greed. She had deliberately destroyed her own son's spine and then spent the following 10 years feeding him livestock tranquilizers, cementing her absolute control over the family fortune. My engineer's mind stopped grieving and went cold. Precise. Calculating. I was no longer a betrayed husband or a broken-hearted father. I had become something else entirely, a focused, utterly motivated predator. And I was going to destroy the monsters who had spent a decade torturing my family. I turned to Conrad, hands clenched into shaking fists at my sides. We are not simply going to arrest them, Conrad. We are going to obliterate every last trace of what they built. Conrad nodded slowly, a predatory, cold smile moving across his face. He got straight to work, coordinating with Captain Pruitt and his task force, methodically laying the legal and tactical groundwork for an inescapable trap. I drove back to the crumbling roadside motor lodge to be with my son. Colton was sitting up in the bed, watching the door with wide, frightened eyes. I settled beside him and put my hands firmly on his trembling shoulders. Then I told him everything: the animal tranquilizers, the gutted trust fund, the tampered brake lines. I watched what remained of his childhood disappear from his face, displaced by a quiet, hardening resolve. I drew him into a tight, protective embrace. "You walked yesterday, son." I told him, the words carrying the full weight of a vow. "Stay up. Tomorrow you are going to stand tall and watch them burn to the ground." We spent the rest of the weekend preparing, sheltered inside that hidden room, waiting for the moment to spring the trap on the woman who had systematically dismantled our lives. Sunday evening came, dragging long, dark shadows across the city. I sat motionless on the edge of the cheap motel mattress, eyes fixed on my phone. The clock turned to 6:00 in the evening. Right on schedule, a text message lit up the screen. From Nadine. The tone was cloying, saccharine, her devoted wife mask perfectly in place. "Heading home early from Fredericksburg, Texas, honey. Miss you both so much. See you in an hour." She had no idea that her empire of lies had already caved in around her, that police were waiting in the shadows, that her chosen victim had become her executioner. A profound, icy calm settled over me. My hands were entirely steady as I typed my brief, deliberate reply, the words designed to walk her straight into the center of the trap. "We are waiting in the living room for you." I set the phone face down on the small wooden end table and looked up at my son. Colton stood straight and still beside the large stone fireplace, freed from the rusted steel wheelchair that had held him for 10 years. He was wearing a charcoal, impeccably tailored suit I had purchased for him just the day before. Shoulders squared, chin level, his posture carrying a dignity I hadn't seen in a decade. The transformation was nothing short of extraordinary. Without the daily dose of heavy veterinary tranquilizer moving through his system, his natural strength and youth had surged back. The thick neurological fog had lifted entirely from his eyes, replaced by a sharp, burning clarity. We took our places in the unlit living room and waited in complete silence. The heavy velvet curtains were pulled shut, and the entire lower floor sank into darkness. I settled into my leather armchair and rested a warm cup of black coffee on my knee. The wait stretched like an eternity. Then the unmistakable crunch of tires on the long gravel driveway cut through the still night. I drew one slow breath and felt my pulse drop into a calm, steady rhythm. Bright headlights swept briefly across the curtains. A large engine idled for a moment and then went quiet. A car door slammed, then a second, a third, a fourth. They had arrived exactly as Conrad and I had anticipated. Heavy footsteps struck the concrete walkway leading to the front porch, far too many for just Nadine and Dr. Draycott. She had brought the muscle we expected. The metallic jingle of her keys drifted through the thick oak door. The brass lock gave a sharp click, and the front door swung inward with a slow groan. Cool night air poured into the dark foyer, carrying the faint trail of Nadine's expensive floral perfume. I sat motionless in the shadows of the living room, fingers wrapped around my coffee mug. Beside me, I heard Colton pull in a slow, steadying breath. Nadine moved cautiously into the unlit hallway. She didn't reach for the light switch. She let out a long, practiced sigh and stepped into her performance. "Gerald," she called out, her voice saturated with a fabricated, aching sorrow. "Honey, are you in here? We are so worried about you." Her heels clicked softly on the hardwood as she advanced. Every syllable was engineered with sociopathic precision. The terrified, devoted wife come to save her ailing husband. "Please don't be frightened, Gerald," she went on, voice breaking with counterfeit emotion. "I brought Dr. Draycott with me. He is right here to help. Your mind is slipping, darling. You are terribly confused and you need immediate care. We're going to take you somewhere you can finally rest." The sound of heavy rubber soles shuffling across the foyer rug followed her words. Two powerfully built men filed in behind Dr. Draycott, dark blue uniforms styled to resemble private paramedics, but their physical presence left no doubt about what they actually were. They carried heavy canvas restraints and thick leather straps prepared to haul me out of my own home by force. Dr. Draycott cleared his throat in the darkness. "Mr. Wentworth," he said, straining for an authoritative tone, "please remain calm. We have the emergency medical orders right here. You are experiencing a severe psychotic break. We need you to come with us peacefully." I said nothing. I lifted my coffee mug slowly and took a deliberate sip. The soft clink of ceramic against the glass saucer rang out in the dark silence. Nadine's head snapped toward the living room archway. "Gerald," she whispered, moving toward it. She reached the wall and slapped the light switch. The crystal chandelier blazed to life overhead, flooding the room with brilliant white light. Nadine stepped fully inside, a practiced, pitying smile arranged across her face. That smile died where it stood. Her eyes stretched wide, enormous circles of raw, disbelieving shock. The designer purse slipped from her fingers and struck the hardwood floor with a dull, heavy thud. Her jaw dropped, her breath caught entirely in her throat. She wasn't looking at me in my armchair. She was staring past me at the impossible figure standing tall beside the stone fireplace. Colton. He stood without support of any kind, looking down at his mother with an expression of pure, quiet disgust. His shoulders filled the sharp lines of his new suit. His legs were planted firm and solid beneath him. There was not a trace of the chemically broken boy she had poisoned for 10 years, only a towering, righteous, undeniable strength. "Mother." Colton said, his voice deep level and edged with a cold fury that filled the room. "You look surprised to see me standing." Dr. Draycott lurched backward into the doorframe, all color leaving his face in an instant. A strangled, pathetic sound escaped his throat, his eyes jerking wildly between Colton's standing form and the empty corner where the rusted wheelchair had always sat. The two hired men instinctively retreated a step toward the open front door, their bravado collapsing as they grasped the reality this was not the helpless, addled old man they had been paid to remove. Nadine began to shake. Her perfectly maintained mask crumbled into something unrecognizable, raw, primal terror staring out from behind it. "Colton," she stammered, her voice a thin, hollow squeak. "How this is impossible. You are paralyzed." I set my coffee mug quietly on the end table and leaned forward. "He is standing because he is no longer ingesting your veterinary tranquilizers." "Nadine," I said, my voice carrying the measured calm of a man who has already won, "we know everything about what you've done." A shriek of pure panic tore out of Nadine's throat. She whipped around and bolted for the open front door and ran straight into a wall of trouble. Conrad Whitley had materialized from the kitchen's shadows, cool and unhurried, a thick sheaf of legal warrants fanned out in his grip and a victor's smile carved across his face. Flanking him as he stepped into the light were Captain Pruitt and 3 uniformed officers, hands settled on their utility belts, ready for anything. Nadine's eyes swept across those badges and those guns, and her manicured hands began shaking at her sides. The trap had closed so fast, it stole the air from her chest. But a woman who had spent a decade engineering other people's ruin does not simply fold, not without reaching for the one weapon she had always trusted most. I could see the cold machinery clicking behind her frightened eyes. A single ragged breath, a subtle shift of posture, and the transformation began. The terror evaporated from her face as though a switch had been thrown. In its place came something theatrical and grotesque, a flood of weeping, her hands flying up to cover her face as a wail bounced off the high ceiling of our living room. "What are you doing to him?" she shrieked, jabbing a trembling finger in my direction, her eyes wide with manufactured horror. "He is completely paralyzed. You are forcefully making him stand against his will. Officers, you have to arrest my husband immediately. He has entirely lost his mind. He is having a psychotic break and actively torturing our disabled son. Please, you have to save my poor boy before his crazy father snaps his spine permanently." She surged forward, arms outstretched, lunging for Colton, determined to drag him back into the chemical prison she had built around him. Captain Pruitt planted himself squarely in her way, his broad frame an absolute wall between that desperate woman and my boy. One calloused hand rose in a firm, wordless command. Nadine dissolved into sobs, burying her face in her palms and playing the shattered mother with a sickening level of craft. She screamed about my supposed dementia, her voice shredding the air as she begged Dr. Draycott to step up and back her story. Dr. Draycott, for his part, couldn't have moved if he'd wanted to. He was nailed to the wooden doorframe by sheer terror, his panicked gaze locked on the warrants fanned out in Conrad Whitley's steady hands. He understood with terrible clarity what those stamped documents meant for every corner of his life. The real estate holdings he had quietly amassed, the medical credentials he had fabricated and sold, all of it was turning to cinders right before his eyes. The two big men in paramedic uniforms had already done the math. Their canvas restraints hit the floor. Both sets of hands went slowly skyward as they retreated toward the foyer walls. Men who had hired out their muscle had no intention of buying a federal prison sentence for a scheme already in flames. Nadine's screaming swelled to fill the room, a frantic, noisy attempt to drown out the truth bearing down on everyone. Then a single voice cut through it all, quiet, measured, and absolutely devastating. "Mother, please stop performing right now." Neither the captain nor I had spoken. The voice belonged to Colton. It was deep, unhurried, and freighted with a kind of authority that no one in that room had heard from him before. Nadine went rigid. The sobs died in her throat as though someone had severed the wire powering them. Her hands dropped slowly. She stood there staring up at the son she had kept imprisoned in his own body for 10 years. And what she saw on his face was not the frightened, helpless boy she had counted on. Colton regarded her with the flat, unsparing gaze of a judge who has already written the sentence. "I have been entirely awake and completely aware for 3 months, Mother," he said, his voice smooth and level, each word a precise incision through the tension blanketing the room. "I have been silently listening to every single whispered phone call you made from the dark hallway outside my bedroom door. I have heard every cruel complaint about my slow physical decline that passed your lips. I know absolutely everything about the forced medical conservatorship you plan to file on Monday morning. I know exactly how you ruthlessly drained the private trust fund my Uncle Leonard lovingly left to ensure my survival." Nadine's mouth fell open. Nothing came out. Every trace of color abandoned her face, leaving that carefully maintained complexion the color of old ash. She had the look of prey that finally understands the jaws have already closed. Her eyes cut frantically toward Dr. Draycott, hunting for some lifeline, but the disgraced physician had both arms raised in limp, trembling surrender as officers pressed in around him from behind. I rose from the leather armchair without hurrying, brushing a hand across the front of my jacket. No raised voice, no outburst. Not a flicker of the white-hot fury that had been burning a hole through my chest for months. Every movement I made was measured, deliberate, the controlled precision of a man who has been waiting a very long time for this exact moment. I dipped into my thick leather satchel and drew out the mountain of documented evidence that Conrad and I had built piece by piece through a long, sleepless night. Crossing to the center of the room, I dropped the whole stack onto the glass coffee table. It hit the surface with a crack that snapped through the silence like a gunshot. I spread the documents wide so that every set of eyes in that room could take in what lay there. These are the highly encrypted offshore bank statements, Gerald said, my voice carrying the lethal weight of an inescapable conclusion. They map every illicit wire transfer you personally signed off on a methodical bleed of my brother's $8 million trust fund, month after month, until nothing remained. Beside those are the certified property deeds, placing Dr. Draycott's hidden luxury real estate portfolio in plain sight, every deed funded by money stolen from my son's future care. I pressed my index finger down on a thick manila folder and tapped it slowly. And in here are the forged psychiatric evaluations, the ones you constructed to have me stripped of my competency, committed and robbed of whatever estate I had left. I let the silence stretch. I wanted the full weight of their ruin to settle into their bones before I moved again. Captain Pruitt caught his officer's eyes and gave a quiet nod. They advanced, drawing steel handcuffs from their belts. Nadine's breathing had turned ragged and shallow, her chest heaving as the gilded world she had constructed came apart around her. She lurched back a step, a heel snagging on the thick Persian rug, but I still wasn't done. The single most damning piece of evidence had been resting against my ribs the entire time. I slid my hand into the inner lining of my winter jacket and drew out one sheet of paper, neatly folded, heavy stock. It was the official chemical analysis that Norbert Callum had produced at the secure private laboratory. I raised it into the full blaze of the crystal chandelier, holding it where both Nadine and Dr. Draycott could not look away from the black ink findings printed on its face. And this, I said, my voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, but every person in that room went absolutely still to catch it, is the official expedited toxicology report. It establishes beyond any legal or moral doubt what has been happening in the dark. This is the heavy-grade veterinary tranquilizer, the severe muscular atrophy agent that you have been purposefully and systematically feeding him for 600 days. The silence that settled after those words was total. It pressed against the walls of the bright living room, like something physical, like a gas that had displaced all the oxygen. Dr. Emil Draycott stood staring at the page in my outstretched hand, his eyes stretched wide with raw animal panic. Every trace of the polished, arrogant clinician had been scoured away. What remained was a desperate man watching his entire existence cave in on itself. Without warning, Draycott let out a guttural cry, hurled his heavy leather briefcase at the nearest officer, and sprinted blindly for the front door. He covered almost no ground at all. Captain Pruitt moved with the instinctive speed of a man who had spent a career making exactly this kind of decision. He cut into the hallway, locked both arms around Draycott's midsection, and took him hard to the polished hardwood floor. The crystal chandelier trembled overhead from the impact. Two more officers piled on immediately, forcing Draycott's flailing arms down and snapping steel cuffs around his pale wrists. The pair of large men in paramedic uniforms, now fully understanding the magnitude of the federal net they had blundered into, made no heroic choices. They simply backed through the front door, palms raised, and walked in silence toward the waiting patrol cars, with their lights throwing red and blue across the street. Nadine stood and watched the entire intricate empire she had spent years constructing come apart into irreversible ruin in the space of a few agonizing seconds. The undeniable physical proof of her decade-long chemical torture rested on the glass table in plain sight, and her chief accomplice was currently groveling on the floor in heavy steel chains. She sank slowly to her knees in the exact center of the plush Persian rug. The expensive fabric of her designer dress pulled gracefully around her as she desperately reached for the last psychological weapon remaining in her manipulative arsenal. She began to cry loudly, forcing heavy manufactured tears to stream down her pale, perfectly contoured cheeks. She looked up at me with desperate eyes, then across at Colton, her voice trembling with a masterful, deeply nauseating performance of maternal anguish. "I did it for us," she wailed, clutching her shaking hands against her chest as though she were the ultimate tragic victim of some profound and devastating misunderstanding. "You have to believe me, Gerald. I only wanted to keep our beautiful family together under one roof." He was going to pack everything, drive off to some massive university in California, and forget I ever existed. He was going to leave me alone in this enormous echoing house without a second thought. I could not endure the suffocating dread of losing my precious boy permanently. I did what any loving, desperate mother would do to hold her family together before it collapsed entirely. I only wanted to keep him safe and close to me always. I stood motionless, staring down in cold silence at the weeping woman I had faithfully loved and blindly trusted across so many years. There was not a trace of human compassion left anywhere inside my cold, methodical heart. I did not raise my voice in anger, and I did not let my righteous fury crack my surgical composure for even a single instant. Instead, I moved slowly and deliberately around the edge of the glass coffee table and came to a stop directly in front of her kneeling, weeping form. With cold precision, I drew a thick stack of documents from my jacket and dropped the damning evidence straight onto the smooth glass surface. Here are your heavily encrypted offshore bank statements, the certified property deeds registered exclusively in Draycott's name, and your fully forged psychiatric conservatorship papers. But that is far from everything. I reached back into my pocket and withdrew the single most horrifying document Conrad Whitley and his trained private investigator had managed to pull from the deepest recesses of your encrypted financial history. It was a faded 10-year-old banking record attached to a crude handwritten invoice from a shady independent automotive garage on the gritty industrial edge of the city. I flung the piece of paper directly at her tear-streaked, deceptive face. It fluttered briefly in the tense air before settling without a sound on the thick rug between her trembling knees. Nadine stared blankly down at the faded ink, her manufactured sobbing halting instantly replaced by a sudden and terrifying inability to pull air into her tightening lungs. That is the billing invoice from the desperate failing mechanic you secretly paid exactly 10 years ago, I said evenly, my voice carrying lethal, unforgiving clarity throughout the room. The offshore bank transfer of exactly $50,000 in untraceable cash was processed exactly 2 days before our son was scheduled to drive his car to Rice University. You did not simply want to keep him close to home, Nadine. You wanted absolute unchecked control over the $8 million medical trust fund my late brother Leonard had generously established for his beloved nephew. You understood perfectly that if Colton left this house as a healthy, independent young man, your legally designated role as his custodial caregiver would evaporate on the spot. Your luxury lifestyle, your endless designer shopping sprees, your lavish hotel stays, all of it would dissolve overnight. You would lose your lucrative access to that family fortune permanently. So you engineered a horrific, entirely deliberate catastrophe. You paid a corrupt mechanic to cut the brake lines on Colton's vehicle. You deliberately caused that life-altering crash on a rainy afternoon. You intentionally shattered your own son's spinal cord so you could steal his $8 million. You obliterated his entire future without a single ounce of remorse. And then you spent 600 days calmly feeding him heavy veterinary tranquilizers to make certain he never walked again. The affluent living room went utterly terrifyingly silent. The full and undeniable reality of her extreme sociopathic greed settled like a weight upon every person present. Even the seasoned, hardened officers standing guard in the shadowy foyer looked visibly sickened, their stern faces twisting in unmistakable disgust at the shivering woman kneeling on the rug. Nadine made no attempt to deny the monstrous truth I had just laid bare. She slowly dragged her eyes away from the mechanic's invoice and looked desperately toward the tall, powerful figure standing by the stone fireplace. She reached out her trembling, manicured hand in his direction, her failing voice cracking into a broken, pitiful sob. "Colton, my sweet baby, please listen to me right now." Colton looked down at the woman who had stolen his youth. He did not flinch, nor did he extend even the smallest gesture of sympathy toward her outstretched hand. Instead, he took one slow, deliberate step backward, drawing his impeccably tailored suit jacket away from her grasping fingers as though her touch were corrosive acid. He stood perfectly upright, a monument of reclaimed strength and unyielding defiance. His face remained entirely composed, a mask of absolute indifference that perfectly mirrored the cold detachment she had shown him every single day across those 600 days. Nadine looked up at him with wide, pleading eyes, her makeup destroyed by her manufactured tears. She opened her mouth to speak, to spin yet another web of elaborate lies, but the crushing silence of the room was shattered by the deep, steady voice of my son. "You are not my mother." Colton stated it plainly, his tone utterly devoid of any remnant of childhood affection or emotional attachment. "You are my warden. You are a monster who deliberately orchestrated a horrific tragedy and then watched contentedly as I suffered inside a rusted cage while you drained my future to bankroll your extravagant lifestyle. I have spent 10 long, agonizing years locked inside a chemical prison entirely of your making, fully aware of my surroundings, yet completely unable to break free from your grip." He paused, letting the weight of his condemnation hang in the cold air, then turned his gaze toward the waiting officers. "Or take her away." The firm, authoritative command from the very victim of her monstrous crimes marked the immediate end of the elaborate theatrical performance. Captain Pruitt nodded sharply to the 2 uniformed officers positioned by the archway. They moved forward with swift, uncompromising efficiency, their heavy boots thudding across the Persian rug. One officer seized her right arm, pulling her upward from her kneeling position, while the other took hold of her left wrist and twisted it firmly behind her back. The sharp, distinct metallic click of steel handcuffs closing around her pale wrists echoed through the living room, marking the absolute end of her reign of terror. "You have the right to remain silent." The taller officer recited calmly, his voice a steady drone that cut cleanly through her sudden, frantic wailing. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the Miranda rights were read aloud, the mask of refined elegance and superiority shattered into countless jagged, irreparable pieces. She began to thrash violently against the officer's grip, her expensive designer dress twisting and tearing as she kicked at the air around her. She screamed from somewhere raw and guttural, pure, unadulterated fury and desperate denial. She cursed my name. She cursed Dr. Draycott for his cowardly capitulation, and she screamed vile insults at the son she had called her sweet baby just moments before. She fought with the frantic, chaotic energy of a cornered predator who finally understood there was no way out. The officers did not waver. They dragged her kicking and screaming across the polished hardwood floor, pulling her forcefully out of the beautiful, massive home she had so ruthlessly tried to steal. I stood quietly beside my son, watching with cold, methodical satisfaction as the violent struggle swept through the foyer and out the heavy oak front door. Conrad Whitley stepped forward, offering a curt, professional nod of acknowledgement before turning to follow Captain Pruitt out into the crisp night air, intent on ensuring the booking process unfolded exactly as planned. The heavy door swung shut behind them, cutting off the frantic noise of the arrests. I moved slowly toward the bay windows and drew the velvet curtain aside, peering out into the dark. Red and blue lights from the patrol cruisers swept across the manicured lawn and the neighboring houses in a dizzying, spinning rhythm. I watched in silence as they loaded Nadine into the back of a secured patrol car, her screaming face pressed against the reinforced glass. Dr. Draycott was already sitting in a separate vehicle, his head bowed in total, miserable defeat. Within minutes, the engines growled to life, and the procession of law enforcement vehicles eased out of my wide gravel driveway. The spinning lights shrank and then vanished into the quiet night, leaving behind a silence so deep it had its own weight. The vast house, once a suffocating prison of deception and chemical torture, felt suddenly still, purged entirely of the toxic presence that had poisoned its rooms for a full decade. I turned away from the window and looked back across the brightly lit living room. Colton and I stood alone in that quiet space, the heavy residue of adrenaline slowly draining from our weary bodies. My gaze drifted to the far corner, settling on the rusted steel wheelchair that had long served as the physical emblem of her cruelty. It sat empty in the shadows, a vile metallic throne of lies that had kept my sharp, vibrant sun shackled to a fabricated tragedy. I studied the worn leather armrests and the dull, scuffed wheels, and felt a sudden immense tide of righteous anger surging up from the deepest part of my exhausted soul. I said nothing to Colton. I turned and walked with heavy, deliberate strides down the hallway, pushed open the side door into the garage, and went straight past my toolboxes to the heavy iron splitting maul resting against the garage wall. I closed my right hand around the thick handle, feeling the cold, reassuring weight of solid iron settle into my grip. Then I walked back into the living room, eyes locked on the empty chair. I raised the maul high over my shoulder and brought it down with devastating force onto the center of the metal frame. The violent crash of shattering steel and snapping plastic rang out like a gunshot through the empty, silent rooms of the house. I swung again and again, smashing the spokes, obliterating the padded seat, reducing that hated instrument of our suffering into a twisted, jagged heap of unrecognizable debris. At last I stepped back and let the maul drop onto the ruined wreckage, feeling an enormous weight lift from my aging shoulders. "It is over," I said, breathing hard into the stillness of the room. Colton stepped forward and smiled genuinely, fully, for the first time in 10 years. "No, Dad. It is just beginning." He was absolutely right. Destroying that rusted wheelchair was not the end of our journey. It was the thundering starting gun of a ruthless, systematic campaign for justice. The weeks that followed moved with blinding speed, federal indictments, courtroom battles, and hard-won vindication arriving in a relentless wave. Nadine and Dr. Draycott were immediately stripped of their lavish lives and thrown into the cold, unforgiving machinery of the criminal justice system. The mountain of evidence Conrad and I had painstakingly assembled proved completely insurmountable. They faced a crushing battery of federal charges: conspiracy to commit attempted murder, large-scale medical fraud, and grand embezzlement. I sat in the front row of the packed courtroom, watching with a stone-cold expression as the arrogant physician and my duplicitous former wife were forced to confront the full weight of their crimes. Nadine attempted to play the victim one last time, weeping loudly before the judge, but the toxicology reports and the mechanic's invoice extinguished any flicker of sympathy in the room. The judge looked down from the bench with undisguised contempt and delivered an ironclad verdict. Nadine and Dr. Draycott were each sentenced to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. They were led away in chains, completely stripped of their dignity, while Colton and I walked out of the courthouse as free men. With the architects of our misery locked behind steel bars, I turned my full attention to the financial battlefield. Conrad Whitley proved to be an absolute predator in the corporate legal arena. Together, we went after the major international bank that had blindly facilitated Nadine's encrypted offshore transfers for an entire decade. We laid bare their gross institutional negligence and their failure to properly monitor my late brother's designated medical trust. Faced with a mounting public relations catastrophe and our overwhelming forensic evidence, the banking executives settled out of court for an astronomical figure. We recovered every stolen dollar, restoring the $8 million trust to its full value. I did not stop there. I petitioned the court to dissolve the toxic conservatorship Nadine had wielded as a weapon for so long. Once the presiding judge reviewed Colton's remarkable cognitive recovery and clean medical evaluations, he granted the request without hesitation. The following morning, I walked into Conrad's downtown office and signed a towering stack of legal documents. I transferred every recovered asset, every property deed, and the full trust fund directly into Colton's name, exactly where my generous brother Leonard had always meant it to be, beyond the reach of any greedy hands. Securing our financial future was a major victory, but the real battle lay far outside the sterile walls of any courtroom or bank. Colton had spent a decade trapped in chemical paralysis, and his body demanded a monumental, agonizing effort to claw back its lost strength. We enrolled him immediately in an elite intensive rehabilitation program built for extreme physical recovery. The daily sessions were brutal, pushing him far past any ordinary human threshold. Every morning, I stood beside him in the bright, echoing gymnasium, watching him drive his recovering muscles to the breaking point. There were days of searing pain when his trembling legs buckled, and he went down hard onto the blue mats, his face drenched in sweat and frustrated tears. His lungs burned as he fought for air, his hands white-knuckled around the metal rails of the parallel bars. But I was always right there beside him. I spotted his heavy lifts. I steadied his shaking shoulders through the balancing exercises, and I kept pushing him forward when pure exhaustion threatened to shatter what was left of his spirit. "You are doing perfectly, son," I would tell him, pressing a cool towel to his forehead. "You are building armor they can never touch again." With each passing week, the transformation picked up speed. Muscles that had wasted away swelled with new power. His uncertain, halting steps grew into a confident, commanding stride. The shadows of his stolen youth fell away, replaced by the hardened, formidable build of a young man who had walked straight through hell and come out the other side unbroken. Our bond, which Nadine's lies had fractured, was now forged stronger than tempered steel through the shared fire of his recovery. He fought through every physical barrier, driven to reclaim every moment that had been torn from him. The cold months of winter gave way to a bright and promising spring, and the suffocating darkness that had pressed down on our home for so long was replaced at last by real warmth and genuine hope. We spent quiet evenings together on the back porch, watching the sun sink over the sprawling property and talking freely about the wide-open future that stretched before him. Colton spoke about his long-deferred dreams with passion, his voice carrying both the hard-earned wisdom of a survivor and the electric ambition of a man entirely reborn. He had spent 10 years locked inside a silent prison, watching the world move on without him, but he refused to let the weight of that lost time hold him down. He poured that immense restless energy into an unstoppable drive for excellence. His late nights were spent bent over thick textbooks and complex blueprints, reigniting the brilliant structural mind he had possessed before the crash took everything. I watched him study with an overwhelming swell of paternal pride, in complete awe of his unbreakable resilience. The deliberate, calculated poison Nadine had used to suppress his brilliant mind had ultimately failed to snuff out his inner light. He was not simply surviving his profound trauma. He was actively thriving, carefully and methodically, charting a bold, magnificent course toward a life that was finally and entirely his own. The deep, agonizing scars of our shared past were permanently carved into our memories, but they no longer held dominion over our daily existence. We had brought down the very monsters who had tried to bury us alive, and we had risen from those ashes stronger, wiser, and completely bound together. Exactly 6 months after that fateful and dramatic night, the crisp, energetic air of a vibrant morning swept briskly across the sprawling city. I settled confidently behind the steering wheel of my beautifully restored classic vintage Ford truck, the deep, steady rumble of the heavy engine vibrating with warmth through my chest. Brilliant sunlight bounced off the polished chrome bumper as I moved through the busy, bustling streets, carrying a profound and absolute sense of inner peace. I turned smoothly onto a wide avenue and pulled up directly in front of a prestigious architectural firm in the heart of downtown Houston. The beautiful, promising new chapter of our lives had finally and officially begun, and I absolutely could not wait to witness what my brilliant son would build next. I pushed the heavy manual gear selector firmly into park and quietly cut the humming engine. The chaotic, suffocating pressure that had relentlessly crushed my tired shoulders for an entire decade was completely and utterly gone. I felt remarkably relaxed, genuinely happy, and deeply at peace for the very first time in what had felt like a lifetime. I unclipped my seatbelt, pushed open my door, and stepped out onto the wide, bustling Houston pavement. A cool morning breeze swept past as I walked around the front grille of the vintage truck and pulled open the heavy passenger door for my son. Colton stepped out into the bright city sunlight. He moved with a careful, measured grace that immediately commanded respect. He carried a slight, lingering limp in his left leg, a permanent physical reminder of the horrific trauma he had bravely endured. Yet he refused to allow it to slow his forward momentum by even a fraction. He steadied himself on a sleek, polished carbon fiber walking cane, gripping its smooth handle with quiet, unwavering confidence. Despite the subtle unevenness in his stride, he stood incredibly tall, projecting an unmistakable aura of strength and fierce, unbreakable determination. He paused on the concrete sidewalk and took a long, unhurried moment to carefully straighten the dark silk tie resting neatly against his crisp white collar. He tilted his head slowly back and looked directly up at the towering, magnificent glass and steel skyscraper rising high above us both. This was the highly prestigious, globally recognized architectural firm, and they had actively pursued him based solely on his undeniable merit and the remarkable strength of his professional portfolio. Today marked his very first official day as a junior architect. He was finally boldly reclaiming the bright and beautiful life that had been so viciously and violently ripped away from him when he was just 18 years old. I stood silently at his side, watching the vivid reflections of passing traffic dance and ripple across the mirrored glass surface of that towering building. An enormous, overwhelming surge of pure parental pride swelled from somewhere deep inside my chest. He had battled through absolute hell, enduring years of dark chemical imprisonment, and had emerged as a focused, highly capable young professional who was now fully prepared to take on the entire world. The journey to reach this precise moment had tested every single fiber of our shared humanity, driving us through an exhausting and brutal labyrinth of relentless legal battles and punishing physical rehabilitation. But seeing him standing here now fully independent and burning with unbridled ambition made every single second of that agonizing struggle feel entirely worthwhile. He had spent countless grueling hours driving his body past its breaking point inside the sterile rehabilitation center, enduring immense physical agony simply to earn the right to stand proudly on this very sidewalk. The vile woman who had secretly poisoned his body and stolen his youth was now locked securely inside a federal penitentiary, serving out her long, miserable sentence with absolutely no possibility of early release. Her twisted, greedy accomplice was enduring the exact same isolated fate, stripped completely of his fraudulent medical license and every dollar of his illicitly acquired fortune. We had methodically and systematically dismantled their entire criminal operation from the inside out, fully recovering the stolen trust fund and legally restoring every single asset to its rightful owner. Colton was no longer a helpless victim confined to a rusted metal wheelchair. He was a triumphant, entirely self-sufficient survivor standing on the very threshold of his chosen professional field, ready at last to claim everything life owed him. We did not exchange grand emotional speeches or shed heavy tears out there on that busy sidewalk. We simply turned toward one another and shared a brief, incredibly powerful embrace. It was a quiet, deeply profound understanding between two men who had stared directly into the darkest, most depraved corners of human nature and had survived that brutal ordeal side by side. He stepped back and offered me a small, steady smile full of genuine hope and profound gratitude. I clapped him firmly on his broad shoulder one final time. He turned away from the truck, gripped his carbon fiber cane firmly, and walked with steady, unyielding purpose straight toward the massive revolving glass doors of the busy lobby. I remained beside the truck, leaning comfortably against the cool metal fender, watching his tall, proud figure dissolve completely into the bustling stream of corporate professionals flooding the entrance. I closed my eyes for one brief, quiet moment and drew a long, incredibly deep breath of the crisp, clean Houston air. The dark and terrifying shadows of our painful shared past were now permanently behind us, replaced entirely by the bright, boundless horizon of a perfectly reclaimed future. The absolute justice we had fought for so relentlessly had finally been delivered, and the unbroken legacy of our family now rested safely and securely in the capable, talented hands of my extraordinary son. I opened my eyes, feeling completely and entirely ready to embrace whatever calm and peaceful days lay waiting ahead, knowing with absolute certainty that the long, terrible nightmare was finally, irrevocably over. The most dangerous enemies are rarely the strangers lurking in dark alleyways. Sometimes they are the ones lying beside us, draped in the convincing illusion of love and devotion. True evil exploits our deepest and most vulnerable trust, twisting our own sacrifices into weapons aimed directly back at us. But no lie, no matter how brilliantly constructed or how many years it is carefully maintained, can ultimately survive the relentless exposing power of the truth. When something deep inside you signals that the people closest to you are not who they claim to be, you must never silence that instinct. A sharp and honest gut feeling is one of the most powerful protective tools a person can possess, and acting with courage and decisiveness is the only reliable way to truly safeguard the people you love. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of this one. This story was not easy to carry, and I imagine it was not easy to hear. Looking back on everything Gerald and Colton endured the decade of stolen years, the courtrooms, the slow and painful rebuilding. What strikes me most is that the truth never stopped pressing forward. It was quiet for a long time, hidden, suppressed, chemically buried, but it kept living underneath the surface. I believe God does not allow that kind of evil to stand forever. The reckoning may be slow, but it comes. And when it finally arrived for this family, it arrived with everything. If this story leaves you with anything, let it be this. First, never ignore a quiet instinct about someone you love. Unease exists for a reason. Listen to it before the cost of ignoring it grows too high. Second, document everything. When something feels wrong, start building a record. Evidence is the only language certain courtrooms understand. Third, healing is not a single moment. It is a daily choice made in a gymnasium, at a desk, on a back porch, watching the sun go down. Fourth, if someone is controlling access to another person's money or medical care, ask hard questions and keep asking until you get real answers. If this story moved, you share it with someone who might need to hear it today. A friend, a family member, anyone carrying a heavy silence they cannot name. And if you are not already part of this community, subscribe to Dad Revenge, so you never miss a story. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and they matter to me more than you know. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourselves and the people beside you. Until next time.